Welcome to this episode of Exploring Machine Consciousness. Today we have with us philosopher and writer Professor Keith Frankish, and we'll be exploring the theory of illusionism and its implications for artificial consciousness. Keith is an honorary professor in the philosophy department at the University of Sheffield, a visiting research fellow at the Open University, and an adjunct professor with the Brain and Mind program at the University of Crete. Keith is best known for his theory of illusionism, the view that phenomenal consciousness, or the subjective feeling of experience, is an illusion. Rather than denying that we have conscious experiences, Keith argues that our intuitive concept of them as inherently mysterious or non-physical is mistaken. As AI systems become more sophisticated, he's asking the question of whether machines will be able to create illusions of consciousness as well. Keith, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you both.
Many thanks for joining us, Keith.
Thank you, Ken.
Brilliant. So let's start off with definitions of consciousness. So the main criticism of illusionism that I hear is that it denies something that is very familiar to all of us, and that's the phenomenal consciousness or the subjective experience. However, you argue that it doesn't deny consciousness, but rather offers a different account of it. So what is that account, and what is consciousness according to illusionism?
Ah, right. Yes, good question. The word illusionism has its advantages and its disadvantages. As I see it, illusionism has two aspects. One is a negative aspect. It involves the rejection of a certain way of thinking of consciousness that is widespread, certainly in philosophy, and also I think, among scientists, among many scientists thinking about consciousness, and AI researchers indeed. One aspect, perhaps the major aspect, is negative. The other aspect is trying to build a better picture of consciousness. And that, I think, is, and so your question was really about the positive aspect. What is consciousness on the illusionist view? I think it's probably easier to say something first about the negative, about what is being ruled out, and then we can see what tools we have to build a better account. Because illusionism is quite open to a wide variety of approaches, positive approaches. The main thing is to get out of a bad way of thinking of consciousness. That's what I'd say. First of all, let's just get rid of one misconception about illusionism. The name tempts some people into thinking that, and I should say that illusionism isn't just my view. I coined the term, but it's a view that many other people have held and do hold, most notably Daniel Dennett. We're not saying that consciousness isn't illusion. We're not saying that people don't really feel pains and pleasures, and they don't really see things and hear things and smell things and taste things. We have all these experiences. Our lives are a continual stream, our waking lives and our sleeping life, a continual stream of experiences. The question is what they are. What are they? There's a very tempting picture of what they are, which is widely adopted among philosophers, and also, as I said, among scientists. They will tell you, the people who adopt this picture will tell you it's the obvious, common sense, everyday picture that everyone adopts. I'm not sure that's true, but to the extent that it is, I think it's an illusion that we suffer from. So what is that? Let me try to introduce it with an analogy. Take life. Now, before the development of modern biology, evolutionary theory, organic chemistry, and these disciplines in the 19th century, I guess it would have been quite attractive to see life as something very special, quite mysterious, and something perhaps that science wouldn't ever explain. There's these inanimate things in the world, and then there are animate things, the things that have a sort of spirit. The rest of nature doesn't have, the rest of the world doesn't have. And so that you could look at a body, say, and the body would seem to be just a collection of bones and flesh and blood and so on. But to make that body come alive, you needed something more than just the various components that made it up. So when Professor Frankenstein was making his artificial man, he collected all the parts and sewed them all together in the right way, let's say. But still, that was just an inanimate lump of matter. To make it alive, you had to infuse some vital spirit into it, or maybe a soul, to give it this strange quality of life, this mysterious quality of life. What's happened there in our thinking about life is that we've gone from thinking about life as some extra ingredient, some vital force, elan vital, soul maybe, that has to be added to the flesh and blood and bone to make it, to animate it. We've gone from that to thinking about it as a cluster of capacities, a cluster of functions that are performed by that physical body, by the the flesh and the blood and the bone and so on. And we've begun to understand how the physical body does these things. Genetics, evolutionary theory, we understand how these complex structures evolved, how they came into existence. Through theory of development, we're understanding how they develop in the individual from the fertilized ovum through to the fully grown organism. Vastly complex process. But what we've substituted is this idea of a simple spiritual force. For that we've substituted this immensely complex set of biological functions. Now, so you might say that in the past we were under a sort of illusion about the nature of life. We thought it was something simple, but amazingly powerful, that was just added to matter, to inanimate matter. We've gone from that to thinking of it as something that is not something extra, but an amazingly complex organisation of matter. And we begin to understand how that organisation came about. Now, that is a pretty good parallel for how I think we should think about consciousness. We start to, as soon as we begin to talk about consciousness, we start to gesture this, what it's like for me now, this inner life that I have, this, what it feels like to be me here, seeing these things, feeling these things, and it just seems to be immediately present to me. The quality of the experience that I'm having. It's just, say it's a pain, there's a quality to the pain that I'm immediately aware of, that is just there for me, that I know about, and that somehow is added to all the complex things that my brain is doing when it responds to say, damage to my body, when pain receptors are firing in my body. There's all these complex things happening in my brain, but then there's this added extra, this pure quality. And this pure quality seems to be something that science really can't get a grip on, because it doesn't really show up from the third person perspective. Only I know what the pain is actually really like, or the smell or the taste or so on. Scientists can investigate everything that's happening in my brain, but they can't sort of penetrate into this private world where the quality is revealed to me, whatever exactly I am in this picture. There seems to be, it's almost as if there's a sort of an inner me who's aware of these inner qualities. And that's quite a compelling picture of consciousness from a pre-theoretical starting point. Just as it was the picture of life as a vital force was quite compelling, say, to people 200 years ago, before we'd started to unpick the complex processes involved. So that picture of consciousness as something almost magical, perhaps non-physical, that is somehow added on to everything the brain is doing. That seems very compelling. And there's a whole vast range of theories that have been built upon that intuition in philosophy, and to some extent in science too, that have been built upon this introspective intuition of consciousness as something like an essence of feeling. And I think that that's an illusion, very much in the same way that I would say that elan vital is an illusion. It's not to say that the experience isn't real any more than modern biology says that life isn't real. It just says it's not quite what it's not the simple, mysterious, extra thing that we tend to think of it as. It's really just a very, very complex set of capacities and dispositions, which we need to unpick slowly, carefully, through lots and lots of detailed, difficult work, until we can build up a picture of the richness and complexity with which we can substitute for this old picture of the kind of magic essence. So that's, if you like, the negative aspect of illusionism. Stop thinking of consciousness in this as a sort of pre-theoretical way, as a magical extra. So how do we start thinking of it? Well, we have to start doing all the really detail. Well, people are doing this, but we have to just carry on doing all this detailed work of understanding exactly what happens when you go into one of these states that we call an experience.
So, Keith, if I can jump in.
Absolutely.
The detailed, complicated, messy stuff, which is analogous to biology when you're talking about life, the detailed, messy stuff when it comes to consciousness it sounds to me like that's the neural correlates, the neuroscience correlates. That's what goes on in the brain, how neurons work, and it doesn't address the subjective experience we have. I'm sure you get this all the time. This is what people say to you all the time. But you do sound like you want to avoid addressing that subjective experience. I'm sure you don't, but it sounds like you do.
It depends what you mean by the subjective experience. If by the subjective experience you mean something extra, over and above all those things that you call the neural correlates, I don't call them correlates, they are the experience, as far as it's like saying, imagine, let's take the parallel again. Suppose someone said to a modern biologist, look, you're only talking about the sort of the physical correlates or the biological correlates of life. You're not talking about life itself. How do all those complicated processes you describe, from the cellular level right up to the complex organization of these bodily systems?
It's a nice analogy, but it seems to me to cheat a little bit, because life as an élan vital may very well be an illusion. Might not be, but let's say it is. But there's no conscious experience of life in the same way that there's a conscious experience of consciousness. You can say there's no élan vital, we can explain everything that's happening with a living being without it, but you can't do the same with consciousness. You can say, this is how consciousness works, this neuron does that, and that neuron does that, but that doesn't explain the stuff that's going on in my head and your head.
The claim is that it does, that there is not, that you are still in the grip of the illusion, that there are two things here, that there's the complex activity, not just in the brain is embodied and embedded in the wider environment. There's all the stuff that it's doing, all the complex discriminative capacities, ability to discriminate things in the world and to discriminate things that are happening inside us, and then all the complex reactive dispositions that those discriminative capacities trigger, all the massively complex reactions we have to stimulation. Those are the whole story. So what is it for you to have a subjective experience? It's for you, the whole entire organism, to have all these capacities for discriminating features of the world and features of yourself, and to react to them in a hugely complex way. Now, those discriminatory capacities and those reactive dispositions are peculiar to you. They've been trained at to some extent. You have a distinct genetic endowment, or certainly distinct. All humans have a different set of capacities from other animals. You have a distinctive set of capacities due to your individual genetic endowment and to your individual history of experience of the world. So you've been trained up to have your own specific take on the world, your own distinct characteristic set of discriminative capacities and your distinctive set of reactions to those. Perhaps yellow things trigger certain associations in you that they don't trigger me. This is your subjective take on the world. It's not something.
Well, is it? I'd argue. I think if I understand the terms correctly, I'm a cognitive functionalist. So I don't think there's anything magic going on. There is simply what's happening inside my brain. There is no other process going on. However, to say that doesn't explain my subjective experience of it. It still requires explanation. Just to say, this neuron does that, that neuron does that, that doesn't capture my subjective experience, and something needs to capture that.
Not at that level of description. Sure, we need to talk about the complex capacities. I mean, it's like saying, what's happening in this cell, the mitochondria or whatever in this cell, or the processes in the nucleus of this cell don't explain life. They don't. No, you need lots and lots of them, organized in lots of ways, doing complex interactions between them, constituting complex bodily systems that are also coordinated. And it's an extraordinarily complex process. Now, of course, if you say, that neuron doesn't, no, of course it doesn't. There are 86 billion neurons in your brain. They're connected up in massively complex ways. The number of connections is I don't know, it's much bigger than that. And we need to think about what they are doing. Now, this is the crucial point, I think. This is a functionalist picture. It says that experience is what the brain is doing, or the embodied brain and the whole wider system is doing. It's not about just the presence of some quality that is observed by some inner observer. Suppose there were this quality. Suppose when I'm in pain, this quality manifests itself to some inner observer, to myself. Okay, somehow, and this quality can't be detected by other people, by science, by scientific instruments. But somehow I detect it. What am I in this picture? If I'm If instruments can't detect it, how can my brain detect it? Maybe I have to be a soul to detect it. I don't know. But anyway, there's this quality. Now, what else happens when you're having a pain? All sorts of reactions. You want it to stop. Your attention is captured by the source of the pain. You have a whole range of emotions, associations, fears, so on, all of which can be analysed in a similar way. There's this whole host of psychological reactions. Now imagine, they're all capable of functional characterization, let's suppose, because we're focusing on the pain, not on them at the moment. Strip away all those. Suppose this quality is there, but I no longer have the reactive dispositions normally associated. I no longer want it to end. I no longer believe that I'm hurt. I no longer fear that this may be serious. I no longer have any negative associations. No memories are being laid down of anything bad happening to me. I'm no longer reminded of times in the past when bad things happened. I'm perfectly content to carry on doing whatever I'm doing. My attention isn't distracted. I'm talking, and if you ask me how I am, I'll say I'm fine. I feel perfectly fine. But the quality, the mysterious quality that's something distinct from all those reactions is still there. This to me doesn't make any sense. If you take away all the reactions, all the effects, you've taken away the pain. The pain is just a cluster of effects. And similarly for all other experiences, we need to cash it out in something dynamic, just as we need to cash out life in something dynamic in terms of the performance of certain functions. Just a mysterious spirit, a mysterious essence of pain. We can still capture all the subjectivity because the reactions that you have to pain or to colours or to sight, to sounds or smells on a different form than I have. They're subjective, they're yours. But they're not yours in the sense of belonging to some inaccessible private mental world where these mysterious qualities are presented to an inner witness.
Okay, so let me ask you this. Imagine you have a perfect scientific explanation. You know, you're the general purpose equivalent of Mary the Colour Scientist. You've got a perfectly comprehensive theory and explanation of how the brain works, and you explain everything that happens in my brain when I see the colour red. But you don't talk at all about my subjective experience. Do you think you've given a satisfactory explanation of my experience of seeing red?
Not if I just talk about it in terms of patterns of neuron spiking and so on. I need to give a much richer explanation in terms of the discriminative capacities that you have, what things you're sensitive to, what things you aren't sensitive to, how you react to the things you're sensitive to. I need to use a psychological vocabulary. Of course I do, because that's what it is. But I don't need to use the vocabulary of qualia, of qualities, of a mysterious non-physical essence. I talk about your individual take on the world. I can do it all in, if you like, in causal terms, in functional terms, in terms of how things are affecting you and how you're reacting to them. There's nothing.
So what's the difference between the psychological language and the language of qualia?
Well, I would say essentially that one can be captured in functional terms, in terms of causes and effects, in terms of what the states do. Rather, the whole thing that I'm trying to resist here is this idea that, in addition to explaining what the brain is doing, we have to talk about what the brain is like intrinsically. This pattern of activity. Let's simplify it. The pattern of activity, let us say, that is pain. Now, that pattern of activity is causing certain things to happen, causing all kinds of reactions, aversive reactions. The idea is that it also, the idea I'm resisting is that it also has an intrinsic nature. There's something it's like to be that pattern of activity, something that is only known by what exactly? The self? The pattern of activity itself? There's some intrinsic nature to it that can't be captured in terms of, in causal terms, in terms of effects. That's what I'm resisting.
Okay, well, that I guess that's where we're stuck on a disagreement, because I insist that there is a subjective experience which your causal explanation hasn't dealt with.
You're in good company. There's lots of people who feel that way, but that's what illusionism is resisting. So I think we've done a good job there of pinning down the difference.
Do you want to have another go at attacking my subjective experience and telling me why I shouldn't worry about it and I should only worry about the causal processes?
I mean, you're using the word subjective experience there, and I think that's a little bit, if I may say, a little bit tendentious, because of course, in one sense, when we talk about subjective experience, we mean what's happening in me when I react to the world, when I attend to something and it has an impact on me. And that's my subjective experience, is my response to the world. Of course, I'm not denying that. What I'm denying is a certain account of what that subjective experience consists in, that it consists in essentially subjective properties, qualia, whatever you want to call them, phenomenal properties, that belong to a private mental world, to another world, not to the physical world, but not to the public world that can be investigated by science, but to some private mental world. The whole point about these qualia is that they're not supposed to be publicly investigated.
And unfortunately, they're not. I can't share my experience of red with you. It's stuck inside my head.
I think you can. I don't think it'd be easy. Thomas Nagel asked this famous question, what is it like to be a bat? And he declared roundly that we couldn't know. Well, I think we can. I think that just sitting in your armchair and wondering what it's like to be a bat isn't going to help you. You need to study bats very, very, very carefully. You need to work to determine what it is that bats are sensitive. What can they discriminate, and what features can they discriminate, and what features can't they discriminate? If they're flying towards a pane of glass, presumably they can tell that it's there because they're using echolocation. What if it's reflective? We need to just do? Can they? What different sorts of surfaces? Which kinds of surface textures can they discriminate? We just need to do loads and loads of experimental work with bats to determine what they can discriminate, first of all, and secondly, how they react to what they discriminate, what effect it has on them. Now, tell that picture in enough detail, and you have the mental world of the bat.
Yeah, I think your position is very brave, but I just can't wrap my head around it. To me, it's inescapable that if I cut my finger, I will feel something that no amount of explanation about the discriminatory faculties I've got, or the causal processes that make me feel the pain, none of that gets anywhere near conveying or explaining the pain. It's there, it's undeniable, and it's not covered by the explanation.
Well, not by any explanation that you could get from reading a textbook, not by any explanation that could be given to you in a few hours, perhaps even a few weeks. But if you understood the complete story of what is happening, then yes, what would be missed out?
If you understood the complete story, you still wouldn't feel the pain.
Well, but that pain wouldn't be doing anything, because you would understand all the causal processes that led to the impact of the knife on your finger through to all your overt reactions. You would understand everything that had happened in between, because that story is a public story that can be told. Okay, so you'd know everything that happened from the impact of the first millimeter of the surface of the knife, right through to all the overt responses and all the psychological upshot of the pain, the memories, and so on. There's no room in that story for some mysterious quality to do anything. So even if there were a quality, it would be a fifth wheel. It wouldn't be making any difference to what's happening.
It might be a fifth wheel, but it still hurts.
I say that the hurting. You see, this is where I say, I'm not denying there's hurting. I'm saying the hurting isn't what you think it is. It's not something in addition to all of those complex processes. It is all of those processes. That is the hurting. That's just as talking about life as if it were a single thing. That's like a single essence, like an essence of animation. Take that pre-theoretical way of thinking about life. That's not completely wrong in a sense, because there is a big difference between living things and non-living things. Living things do all sorts of amazing things, like maintaining their integrity over long periods of time through change. And other things, inanimate things, don't do that. And it's an amazing feat. And it's, the evolutionary story about how it came to be is wondrous. So that you are picking up on something real there when you say that life seems completely different from inanimate things. It's just a mistake to think it's a simple unitary thing that's just conferred on matter somehow, infused into matter, that a soul, whatever.
Well, like I said, I don't really buy that analogy. I don't think that's entirely fair.
I say that one reason you don't is because we're at the stage now, really, we're starting to unpick these stories about consciousness, but we're still at a very early stage, just maybe sort of in the position, I don't know, 200 years ago with respect to life. But okay, yes, sure.
Brilliant. So that's the definition of consciousness question done. So, um, in your talk at the AI and Sentience conference, you argued that building machine consciousness, so I'm going to bring the conversation over to machine consciousness now, is not a well-defined project. So why do you think it's a poorly defined project, and how do you think we should go about defining this project?
Oh, great. Yeah. Well, I think I can use my analogy with life again. Think about building artificial life. If someone say, look, I've got this project for building artificial life, I think the response will be, well, which aspects of life? Are you talking about building a machine that can sustain its integrity, that can draw on sources of energy, metabolize them, maintain homeostasis, and so on? Are you talking about something that can reproduce, that is able to respond to stimuli? There's all sorts of different aspects of life, and I think the appropriate response would be, well, which aspects of life are you trying to create artificially, and to what degree? And it wouldn't necessarily be a clear-cut question. If somebody produced something like an artificial virus, would that count? Because we're not even sure whether viruses count as being alive. Natural viruses count as being alive. So the answer would be, well, life's a multidimensional phenomenon. Each of these dimensions are, graded. So just tell me more precisely which aspect of life you're trying to create and to what degree. Okay, and then we can sort of get a grip on what you're doing and evaluate it. And if they said, well, I'm just trying to create pure life, okay, it's something other than all of those things, but I'm hoping that if I create enough of those other things, those various capacities associated with life, it will become alive. You would think, well, you're not really thinking about this right, are you? There's something extra to create. And that's very much how I think about consciousness. The idea of creating artificial consciousness seems to me about as ill-defined as creating artificial life. There's various things that are involved in consciousness, all sorts of discriminative capacities with regard to the world and to one's own physical state. All sorts of reactive dispositions linked to those discriminative capacities. But these are across multiple different sensory modalities. The dimensions of reaction, again, across multiple different dimensions of reaction, cognitive, emotional, and behavioral, obviously. And just tell me more precisely which aspects of consciousness, which aspects of experience, as we have it, you're trying to replicate, and then we can assess whether you've succeeded. But if you say you're just trying to create consciousness, I don't really know what you mean. You're trying to create something that is in some respects like the states that I'm in when I see and hear and smell and feel pain and so on. Yeah, okay. Which aspects to which degree? And how do they compare to the states that other animals are in when they experience the world?
Unfortunately, I think what people who are trying to, I don't think there's that many people trying to create machine consciousness, but those who are, I think, are trying to do exactly what you think is unavailable because it doesn't really exist. So they're trying to get machines to feel that pain when the knife cuts into their skin. And they're trying to get it to arise in a way that is not explained by all the causal processes that make it arise. Now, they may well be cognitive functionists and agree with you that there's nothing else going on than those electrochemical processes or just electrical processes if it's in a silicon substrate, but that you haven't explained everything if you haven't explained how it feels for it to happen. So I can see why you don't think it's a well-formed project, because you think the actual fundamental endeavor is not worth doing.
And not only that, even on their own terms, it's a dead end, because how could they possibly know whether they'd succeeded? If you insist that pain is not publicly detectable or its presence cannot be inferred from stuff that is publicly observable, like presence of theoretical posits can be, then you've no way of telling whether you succeeded. You'll need some metaphysical theory linking the public world to the private mental world. And the trouble is, there are 1,001 varieties of these, and you can take your pick. Some people think that every particle of matter is conscious, has one of these private mental worlds, the panpsychis. Some think that it's only human brains that do. There's all positions in between. You can take your pick, and there's no way of testing between these metaphysical theories. It's just a matter of which you think
that may be true, although maybe there's a kind of triad of things you can do. One is you can figure out what are the physical processes that go alongside consciousness in animals. Secondly, you can identify the major markers, so whether things can detect themselves in a mirror and so on. And thirdly, you can do a whizzed up version of the Turing test, which is only applicable to verbal entities. But with all of these three things, you can assemble enough evidence to not be completely certain that's true. There is no, at the moment, and as far as we know, never will be, any definitive proof that something else is conscious, and this applies to us as well. But you can assemble enough evidence that every reasonable person would agree, which is, and the reason why this isn't daft, the reason why this isn't insufficient, is that that's exactly what we do with each other. We attribute consciousness to each other with a high degree of confidence because we fit all of those tests. The neurophysical processes are going on, the markers are there, and we all pass the Turing test. So we say, okay, Keith is conscious, Callum is conscious, Will's conscious. And you could do that with a machine. So it wouldn't be unreasonable to apply the same tests to a machine as we apply to other animals.
I think that's with respect, I think that's completely the wrong way of thinking about it, because these markers, what you're looking for is, it's not the neural correlates of consciousness in this private sense. You're looking for the neural correlates of the behavior that you take to be markers of that invisible thing. And what grounds your confidence that those things are markers of it? What grounds your confidence that when somebody says, I'm in pain, they really are in pain? Okay, well, we take it for granted. Yeah, fair enough. But what about behaviors? What sort of behaviors are reliable markers of consciousness? If I stamp on a cockroach and it starts twitching, this sort of twitching is the sort of behavior that if a mammal was doing that, we'd say that was a clear indication of consciousness. This is in the cockroach. There's no way of knowing, because you're trying. You've just, in looking for the neural correlates of the behaviors that you take to be correlates of consciousness, you've just introduced another variable that is equally hard to relate to the reality. There's no way of testing whether that behavior really is a marker of consciousness. Now, you say in our own case, we infer consciousness. I don't think we do. I don't think I do. I really don't. I think if you're around someone who you know pretty well, indeed with an animal, you can pretty well tell what state they're in just by looking at them. You can see their reaction. Well, I think
my partner could be a philosophical zombie. I have no way of knowing for absolute 100% certain that she's not.
I think you're in a grip of an illusion about what consciousness is. I think that is you're expressing very clearly, and I with full respect, because a lot of people think of it exactly the picture that I think you're in the grip of. This idea that somebody could be behaving in all of... Sure, people can act, sure, people can pretend, can act, but I'm talking about consistent patterns of behavior over long extended periods.
Large language models do a pretty good job of it.
They do not, because all they do is produce language. All they produce is linguistic output, which we massively overvalue as an indication of mentality. They produce a tiny one-dimensional strand of reaction. I can tell when my dog's in pain. I don't need to make an inference to it. We have this, and this is a deeper part of the illusion. I think we have this first-person epistemology, which, of course, if we like, we can go and pin back on poor old Descartes. I don't think I think it's a fundamentally non-naturalistic epistemology. The idea that all that you really know is what's here in your private mental world, and everything else somehow has to be inferred from that. I don't think so. I think we're right there in the world. We're part of it. We're constantly in dynamic interaction with it. We aren't separate from it. It's instead of asking, what can I be sure of? Descartes should have asked, what can we collectively be?
I don't know. I think Descartes asked exactly the right question, and then he cheated. He said, "I can doubt everything except for that there is consciousness going on." He unreasonably extended that to, therefore, I am doing the thinking. All you can really know is that there is consciousness going on. And then his reinsertion of the world, or his reintegration of the world, was a total cheat by saying, I have a concept of perfection, and I'm an imperfect being, and therefore I couldn't have a concept of perfection. So a perfect being gave me that concept of perception, and that perfect being is God. Therefore, God, we bring him back into the world, and in a puff of blue smoke, he brings everything else back in because God wouldn't fool us all. So the whole thing is real. I mean, absolutely outrageous sleight of hand.
What is this consciousness that he's aware of going off? Yes, he's aware of something's happening. Okay, he can say that. He can certainly say something's happening, but I have no idea what it is. I have no idea how to conceptualize it, but he does. He can conceptualize it as something that is non-spatial, that isn't extended. He starts imposing conceptualizations on it. All he can say is something's happening.
That is all he could say.
Well, exactly. That's not consciousness. Consciousness is more than something. I mean, maybe what's happening is a lot of brain activity, for all he knows. The point is that our first-person perspective, you see, this is the crux of it, I think. And it's the thing that what people I call phenomenal realists, they think that we have a bedrock of knowledge, that is our immediate awareness of our own consciousness, of the nature of our own experiences. And the nature of those experiences is revealed completely to us. Now, that's a very non-naturalistic picture. If we are evolved biological organisms, there's no way we could have that sort of knowledge even of ourselves. Our knowledge is going to have to be mediated by, constructed through processes of detection, discrimination, and so on. We're not going to have this instant knowledge just by being whatever we are. So it's a very non-naturalistic, it's attractive. This is why I think illusion is the right term. We feel as if we have this all the world around us may be insecure, our knowledge, but this knowledge of our private mental worlds is secure and absolute. That's the illusion. We are there isn't a private mental world. There is just one world of which we are immensely complex and self-reflective parts. That's how I see it. And I grant you the intuitions that you're appealing to. I think they're very interesting intuitions, and I think we need a psychological explanation of them. I'm not saying we should. You're wrong to have these intuitions. Maybe there's a good reason why we conceptualize ourselves in that way. Maybe there's an evolutionary advantages to thinking of ourselves as little private centers of agency and importance, as little souls. And maybe, because all sorts of reasons. But I think it's misleading, and it's certainly, it's not just, I think, a misleading basis for a science of consciousness. It's even if it were true, it would provide no basis. We might as well just stop doing science of consciousness if that were true, because you can't do experimental work on something that's irreducibly subjective. You just have to. The only project is the only real scientific project is the one that illusionists endorse.
So yeah, thanks, Keith. Talking of tests of consciousness, we've spoken a bit about different tests of consciousness, or if we reduce consciousness to these functional processes, what kind of things would we be looking for specifically in machines? What would we be looking for them if they were going to create these same kind of illusions of consciousness that you're speaking of?
Well, there's two things here. There's consciousness, and then there's the illusion of this mysterious kind of consciousness. The illusion that consciousness has these strange properties. It involves these strange properties, qualia. Now, I think a creature or an artificial system could be conscious without having that illusion. Okay. I think the illusion is a certain way we think about our own consciousness. Okay. Now, I think that many non-human animals are robustly conscious, but they don't have this illusion because they don't have this way of thinking about their own experiences and conceptualizing them in this way. Okay. So I don't think that you need the illusion of phenomenal consciousness, the illusion of qualia, if you like, in order to be conscious. Okay. So it's not, the illusion isn't a sort of another account of what consciousness is. So the talk about the illusion is associated with the negative aspect of illusionism, which is getting rid of a bad way of thinking about it. Okay. And I don't think you need to have that bad way in order to be conscious. Okay. So let's just talk about, so we can still talk about what would be required to have that illusion. But let's just start with consciousness itself. I take it that by consciousness, we're just mean the having of experiences, attentive experiences, seeing, attentively seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, feeling pain, and so on. Okay, just being vividly aware of the world around us. Okay, and that is something that can be explicated in terms of, as I said before, in terms of the capacities to discriminate different states of the world, different stimuli, and to react to those stimuli in appropriate ways. Depending on the nature of the stimulus. If it's a pain stimulus, then obviously there's all sorts of aversive reactions that you're going to have. If it's the smell of food, then there's going to be a whole host of other reactions. But you can spell this out in pretty much in engineering terms. You need to have the system. System needs to be able to have sensors that can make these discriminations. It needs to have processing capacities for interpreting the data from those sensors, classifying them, integrating them, yada yada yada. Building a model of the world, and then that needs to feed into all sorts of control systems that produce the range of reactions. And if you build something that does that in respect of, say, let's say one very specific sense, let's say smell, that can do that in relation to a range of different odors in pretty much the way that we can do it, and produce the similar range of reactions, which involves having a very rich psychology as a background for this, because it's got to feed into these experiences have got to feed into a wide range of control systems for all sorts of other bodily systems, which is why LLMs don't have experiences, because they only have one output, linguistic. So if you could reproduce all that, then well, you've got that kind of experience. There's nothing. There isn't a further question. Yes, but is it consciously doing that? Consciousness just is doing that. It just is aware of that, and it is reacting to it richly.
So I guess what you're saying is, if you recreate the functional processes, the consciousness kind of will take care of itself.
Yes, that's what I said. Focus on those. Ask yourself. Don't ask yourself, can we make this thing conscious? Ask, well, why? What's the purpose of that anyway? Why? Ask yourself, what do I want my AI to do? Ask yourself about what kind of capacities you want it to have, and work on making it like that. Now, if at some point you say, well, we've given it all of this rich range of sensory capacities, discriminate all these different states very much in the way that we can, it reacts to them very much in the way that we do. Is it conscious? Well, that's largely a terminological question now. Are its capacities, discriminative capacities, reactive dispositions sufficiently close to ours to say, well, we'll call it conscious? But that's just that we're not picking out some further feature by that term. Now, so that's why I say focus on the functions and let consciousness look after itself. It's just as with life. If you're asking, can we make artificial life? Well, focus on replicating the various functions that are involved, that living creatures have, and then at some point you'll say, well, we may as well call it alive now. But there isn't going to be some sudden point where life pops into existence. It's getting more and more like it, and now it's like asking, I can't remember which philosopher asked the question, can a submarine swim? Well, it's just a terminological question. As for the illusion of consciousness, I think that comes from the illusion of phenomenal consciousness, the illusion of having this essentially private mental world that can't be explained in third-person terms. I think that is a result of our internal monitoring, self-monitoring systems in the brain that monitor these complex reactive processes that are occurring within us. So it's a sort of higher level process. So there's this complex engagement with the world at a first order level, which I think we share with, to some degree, with most of the animal kingdom. Perhaps even with plants have a form of this. So there's this first order engagement with the world, that sort of looping of stimulus and response, which is and the response shapes the next round of stimulation, of course. So it's a continual feedback thing. So that's, if you like, experience, right? And then there is, I think, self-monitoring of that in us, and a conceptualization of what's happening, which results in our picturing ourselves as having an internal world. So this first order thing gives us, as it were, gives us a world around us, gives us an engagement with the world. And this higher order monitoring gives us an engagement with that first order engagement. So we're not just sensitive to the world, we're sensitive to our sensitivity to the world. We don't just react to the world, we react to our own reacting. And it's this higher level of experience, if you like, that in creatures with the right sort of, with linguistic capacities and the right sort of concepts, leads us to talk about this mysterious inner world that we have. It's a matter of self-monitoring. And I don't know which other creatures have that. I don't know if any other creatures have that. It doesn't seem to me ethically important. I don't think you need to have that in order to be an appropriate object of ethical concern. I think the first order stuff, the fact that you're very sensitive to the world and that certain things affect you very negatively in a way that you don't like, you really hate to be in this state and it's very distressing to you, that's enough to be a subject to moral concern. You don't also need to conceptualize it in the way that we do.
So on the topic of moral concern, conscious experience or sentience in particular are often seen as a prerequisite for moral concern or moral status. Do you think we'll get to a point where we'll need to give machines moral status? And what do you think this might look like, or when do you think that point might be?
We probably will, but I think it's going to be a matter of how complex their reactions to the world are. It's not just enough to have a really complex range of discriminations. It's what effects those discriminations have. And what you need, I think, for this is to, well, first of all, you need to be a creature that has a sort of investment in itself, that has the ability to maintain itself, maintain its integrity, that wants to survive and to maintain itself, that has interests. Okay, that isn't just a machine that we plug into something and switch on, but it has an actual integrity and identity and a sense of self-preservation and self-concern. Not necessarily explicit, but that it has the sort of integrity that an organism has. The things we've created don't. They don't exist independently of us. We need to supply them with power and so on. They're just adjuncts of us, really. So you need to create things that are, in fact, I think you need to create something like artificial life. You need to create creatures that have their own independent existence, their own interests, that have a good and bad for themselves. Okay. Not in some metaphysical sense, but just simply have things that they have purposes, the purpose of sustaining themselves, protecting themselves, continuing their existence, and for whom, therefore, things matter. Things that tend to impede their survival are bad. Things that tend to promote it, power, food, whatever, they're good. So you need to create creatures that matter to themselves. Okay, and then you can assess things that are happening to the creature in terms of whether they promote its well-being, promote its flourishing, or don't. And then you have something that you can start to incorporate into our ethical framework. Again, it won't be that there's some sudden transformation where it suddenly has a soul and it matters, or has an inner life and that it suddenly matters. It's going to be a gradual process, and I think we'd get, if we do create, I think we're going to have to create things that are more like self-sustaining robots. That's the route to getting ethical concern. I don't think you're going to get it with just things like LLMs, whose engagement with the world is so impoverished. Despite the fact that they produce streams of language which we take to be indicators of a rich psychological involvement, because they are in us, but in LLMs they aren't. Then there's no psychological involvement. There's no psychology beyond the massively trained up language net. So yes, if we start to build the right sort of creatures that have an independent existence and an independent interests, then yes, I think we would find it inescapable that we should include them in our. I hope we will, because this is very much what the rest of the creatures around us in the world are like, and sadly, we don't take enough care of their interests at the moment. And I would hope that the two things might go together, that we might realise that we're not the only creatures whose existence matters on this earth. And we haven't been for a long time. And we'll maybe have some artificial...
Yeah, that kind of echoes what we spoke with our previous guest, Mark Solms, about his kind of creating robots that give a damn, he called it. That they need to care. They need to care about themselves and about the way that they function in the world.
Exactly. And I think LLMs are really quite a big red herring here. And what we've done is we've produced things that simulate an aspect of human behavior that is very central to us as very talkative creatures, and we read into quite legitimately, we read into our linguistic exchanges all sorts of a rich psychological background to them, psychological and physiological background to them. We've managed to produce things that can mimic that without any of that background, and I think it's very important we realise that. To come back to the questions about consciousness and ethics, evolution didn't set out, as it were. Well, of course, it didn't set out to do anything, but it didn't select for consciousness. Didn't select for a sort of creatures that would have some intrinsic value. It selected for creatures with certain capacities, and eventually it selected for social creatures of a certain kind that came to develop these notions, ethical notions. I think notions of consciousness and of the significance of the internal life of each other and so on, which are embedded in this social thing. And if we follow a similar path, then we'll have similar things happening. It looks like, though, what we're doing is taking a very un-evolutionary approach to this. LLMs could never have evolved naturally. If you think of how absurd it would be to suppose that they did, that there would be these creatures sitting around who could do nothing except talk. Couldn't look after themselves, couldn't survive, couldn't reproduce, but just sat around chattering. I mean, I can't remember which biologist it was said that nothing in nature makes sense except in the light of evolution, or nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I think we're going to need an evolutionary lens on what we're doing in AI as well. I think it will help, at least.
So maybe more of an evolutionary style, an evolution, starting at the basics and building it up slowly, rather than jumping straight into.
It would be good to keep that perspective in mind. Certainly, if we're interested, what are we trying to do with AI? I think there's a lot of confusion. One thing that, one thing we're doing is trying to produce products that people will buy and use. Okay, that's not an evolutionary thing at all. That's just it's just whatever toys take people's fancy. The other is trying to shed some light on our own nature and on human capacities such as consciousness and so on. And then we do need to take an evolutionary perspective, because all the time we need to be asking, what are these things for? I mean, what is an LLM's linguistic ability for? It's for nothing except pleasing its users. It's got no independent value to the thing itself.
What if the for was for humans to try and understand how consciousness is created?
Then I think we would again need to definitely. Well, perhaps not evolution is perhaps not the right word, but certainly a more functional perspective. We need to. We need to think about what consciousness is for, first of all, and it's a question that is the way of thinking consciousness that I resist, this idea of consciousness as some intrinsic feel that is not conceptually connected to any effect, it's just the way it feels. That prevents that question from being asked. You can say, well, all these functions are being performed, it's doing all this stuff, but does it actually feel anything? You see, the question of feeling becomes completely separated from the functional question. Once you do that, then you can't get a grip on, you can't get any explanatory grip on it. And similarly, you can't get any engineering grip on it. And you can't marry the engineering project to the explanatory project. I would maintain that even if I'm wrong, completely wrong about the nature of consciousness, it's the only way to approach the scientific study of it. Because if there is this private world as well, it's just there and it's doing whatever it's doing, and there's nothing we can do to explain it or to engineer it. So we might as well just carry on with the stuff we can do, and maybe in a couple of 100 years our worries about this other stuff will have disappeared, as they did with life.
So, Keith, what was it that led you first to the view that consciousness might be an illusion? Was there a kind of eureka-like moment at which it dawned on you, or was it a gradual shift?
Well, again, I'll just add a little caveat about I'm not saying consciousness is an illusion. I think that we have an illusion about what consciousness is. But anyway, no, I think I've always had a naturalistic view of the world. I've always been interested in how things work. I've never been happy with the idea that there were just irreducible mysteries. Which seems to me in an odd way, to reduce the mystery of the world. Not to reduce the wonder of the world. Just positing irreducible stuff doesn't explain anything. It's not exciting. It doesn't enrich things. It just says, no, you can't know any more about that. It's a mystery. Stop. I don't like that. I like to understand how things work. Maybe it comes from my father, who's an engineer, and I just I'm fascinated by how things work. And when I learned at school about evolutionary theory, I thought it was amazing how we can explain the origin of these fantastically complex systems that are obviously designed, but not designed by an intelligent designer, but designed by this wonderful process blind process of natural selection. I was just amazed by it. It seemed to make the world seem so much more wonderful, to be told, to learn that there was this billion-year history of gradual adaptation behind a billion-year history of research and design, if you like, as Daniel Dennett would call it, not conscious research and design, but trial and error behind the world. I just thought, well, we're part of that. We're not. This is how we came about. We're fully part of this world. And I like this idea. I don't like the idea that, it appeals to me, the thought that we're just part of this wonderful world. We're not separate from it. And so I didn't like the idea that we have some special metaphysical essence that other things don't have. And this idea that maybe there are, some animals that are non-conscious and we are conscious and we have the special thing and they don't have it. And it seemed to me an unscientific way of looking at things, because we know that nature is gradual, changes are gradual. And so the idea that at some point there was this inner light that came on in the heads of certain creatures, and some creatures don't have it and therefore they don't matter. It seemed to me a divisive, non-naturalistic, uncompassionate, I never found it remotely attractive emotionally. And then when I read works like Daniel Dennett's 1991 book, Consciousness Explained, I saw how there is another way of looking at this, which seemed to me infinitely more exciting and rewarding and wonderful. One thing I really like, some people I think perhaps of me and certainly of others who think, that we're kind of hard-headed reductionist types who don't just want everything to be a machine and don't want to acknowledge the, if you like, the poetic dimension of it. I don't know that at all. I think poetry is wonderful. I write poetry and I think of the world as a domain of poetry, of wonder and imagination and so on. But I don't see any of that as being incompatible with it also being explicable and understandable and comprehensible. The poetry is in our reaction to the world, in what it does for us. Again, it's dynamic. The world inspires and enthuses me. It's not that it produces some, qualia of enthusiasm. No, it moves me. It affects me across all sorts of dimensions. This is the poetry and the wonder of the world, as it seems to me. So no, there's not been a moment. Dennett called this view illusionism. He wrote a little comment on the paper in which I first coined the term, and he called it the obvious default theory. Seems to me it is. If you're wanting, the people who don't take this view are taking the inflationary view of conscience, like an inflationary view of life as involving something extra, above and beyond the resources available to natural selection and so on. They're the ones, it seems to me, who've got to to make the case for their radical view.
And how about the self? If we have illusions about consciousness, if I've expressed that right, do we also have illusions about the self? Is the self something that persists?
Again, I think it's a matter of, we certainly say we here, it depends who we're talking about. If you think the self is some kind of immaterial soul, then yes, I think that's an illusion. If you think of but that doesn't mean that talk about the self is meaningless. It doesn't capture anything. Again, I like Dennett's view about this. The self is the story organisms tell about themselves. We're very talkative organisms. We're continually telling each other and ourselves about ourselves. We're spinning stories. We're picking out bits of, we're weaving narratives composed out of selective bits of our history. Sometimes these stories are good. Sometimes we tell bad stories about ourselves and we get depressed or whatever. But we weave these stories, and these stories are continuous, and they incorporate bits of memories, but also interpretation, aspiration, and so on. And it's this story, I think, that is the real persisting thing. I mean, obviously, there's an organism that has undergone all sorts of changes, but is broadly continuous with the one that I was many years ago now. But what makes that organism me is the fact that there's a continuous thread of story that has been told by this organism, and that incorporates its sense of who it is and who it wants to be.
So that's an account which I am drawn to, but I think it leads to dissolving the self as a concept, and it's hard to see how a story could be an appropriate subject of credit or blame or punishment or responsibility.
Well, it's not really the story that gets punished, is it? It's the organism. We get into issues now about punishment and so on, and which are not ones that I've got deeply invested in. There are all sorts of pragmatic reasons for at least restraining antisocial people and quarantining them. Whether there is a justification for retributive punishment, that's a tricky question. I'm not sure about it. I mean, to some extent, this is a matter of pragmatics, of how we maintain a functioning society, and the ethics of it maybe do need rethinking. Just as many people think that it does. I certainly don't really believe in retributive punishment. I don't think it's though it may be there may be a pragmatic function in keeping these attitudes, just to sort of keep things running smoothly. But I do think that there's another sense in which these stories do correspond to our everyday notion of the self, because stories can live on after their tellers, and they can continue to inspire. Sherlock Holmes has had a vast influence on many people, even though he never really existed. So, my story, I hope, will be remembered, and may, perhaps in some ways, I remember this is deluding myself, inspire some people. It's certainly a way of thinking about survival, and about why it's important to cultivate a healthy sense of self. Selves are patterns. Everything's patterns, really. These stories are patterns. It's picking out patterns in the activity of this organism that I particularly want to highlight and memorialize and pass on. So I think it can capture this. This is how the whole perspective that I have, which is very much derived from Dennett, is that many of our folk ways of thinking about things, our pre-theoretical ways of thinking about things like free will, like consciousness, like life, like the self, can't be taken literally, if you like. It can't be taken into inflationary sense. But it doesn't mean we have to give them up, because they're too important to us. But we need to rethink them a little bit, so that we can hang on to them in the face of what we know from modern science. We don't want to have notions of the self and consciousness and life that are just incompatible with what science is telling us about who we are and our place in the universe. We want they're too important to make them vulnerable in that way to scientific refutation. But if we rethink them in this way, if we rethink them in a way that's compatible, then we can hang on to them. We can keep their specialness and their preciousness to us. So I don't want to get rid of consciousness. I want to rethink consciousness in a way that it's not vulnerable to elimination by discoveries in neuroscience.
Yeah. Well, I think that's a good point to bring this conversation to a close, and with the idea that we are really all stories, and let's hope that we all live happily ever after. Keith, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the podcast.
Yeah, thanks very much, Keith.
I enjoyed it.